In the winter of 425 BC, a Spartan woman named Gorgo stood in the stone courtyard of her family's modest home, watching as state officials examined her newborn son. The baby was 3 days old. He was healthy, strong-lunged, and had come into the world without complications. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was whether the 5 elderly men circling her child would decide he was worthy of life, or whether they would take him to the Apothete, the chasm in the Taygetus Mountains where Sparta disposed of infants deemed unfit for their warrior society. Gorgo had already lost 2 children to the Apothete. Her first son had been born with a slightly twisted foot, gone. Her daughter had been too small, her cry too weak, gone. This third child was her last chance. At 27 years old, she was approaching the age when Spartan society would consider her past prime breeding years. If this child was rejected, if she failed to produce an acceptable warrior for the state, her husband would be encouraged to take a younger wife. Gorgo herself would become invisible, a failure in the only role Spartan women were allowed to value. The officials moved slowly, deliberately. They examined the baby's limbs, checking for any asymmetry or weakness. They measured his skull. They tested his reflexes by exposing him to sudden loud noises and watching how he reacted. They even assessed the strength of his grip by letting him grasp their fingers and then trying to pull away. One official held the naked infant at arm's length, studying him in the morning light, looking for any imperfection that would mark him as unworthy of Spartan citizenship. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, the lead official spoke. Acceptable. That single word meant Gorgo could keep her son, for now. But it also meant that her child belonged to Sparta from this moment forward. His life would be orchestrated by the state. His body would be shaped according to Sparta's needs. His purpose would be singular: to become a weapon in human form, or to die trying. What you're about to discover comes from archaeological evidence unearthed at Spartan settlement sites, beginning in 2003, from recently translated documents found in Athenian archives that recorded observations of Spartan practices, and from accounts written by Greek historians like Xenophon and Plutarch, who had direct access to Spartan sources. This is the story of how one city-state created the ancient world's most feared warriors through systematic human breeding, brutal selection processes, and practices so extreme that even other Greeks, who weren't known for their gentleness, considered them barbaric. Sparta was unique among Greek city-states, not for its military prowess alone, but for how it subordinated absolutely everything, including human reproduction, family bonds, and individual identity, to the creation of warriors. Where other Greek cities balanced military needs with commerce, culture, art, and philosophy, Sparta rejected all of that as weakness. They built a society with a single purpose: war, and they were willing to do absolutely anything to achieve perfection in that purpose. The Spartan system, called the ego, is usually presented in modern popular culture as a tough military training program. That's a sanitized lie. The ego was eugenics combined with systematic child abuse, psychological torture, and deliberate destruction of family bonds, all operating under state control for over 400 years. It turned children into weapons, and it destroyed anyone who couldn't survive the process. Let me tell you how Spartan breeding actually worked, starting from before conception, because the system began with controlling who was allowed to reproduce and under what conditions. Spartan men were required to marry, but marriage in Sparta had nothing to do with love or companionship. It was a state function for producing children. Men who refused to marry faced public humiliation and legal penalties. They were excluded from certain religious festivals, denied political privileges, and subjected to a ritual where young women would circle them during winter festivals, striking them and singing songs, mocking their failure to fulfill their civic duty. But being married didn't mean a Spartan man had exclusive access to his wife. The state actively encouraged genetic diversity through what they called wife sharing. Though that term sanitizes what was really happening. If a Spartan warrior was considered especially strong, brave, or skilled, state officials would identify women of childbearing age who should be bred with him, including women already married to other men. The husband had no say in this. If state breeding coordinators decided his wife should conceive a child with another man to produce better warrior stock, he was expected to cooperate and raise the resulting child as his own. Refusing this arrangement could result in loss of citizenship rights or even exile. Historical accounts describe a formalized process where a husband would literally bring another man to his house, introduce him to his wife, and then leave them alone for the night. This wasn't consensual polyamory. It was state-mandated reproductive control, where individual desires, family bonds, and personal dignity were all subordinated to the goal of genetic optimization. Women had slightly more power in this system than in most Greek societies, but only because Sparta needed them healthy and strong to produce healthy, strong children. Spartan women exercised publicly, which was scandalous in other Greek cities. They trained in athletics, practiced wrestling, and participated in competitions. But this wasn't about women's rights or gender equality. It was about breeding. Sparta wanted physically powerful women because they believed physical strength in mothers produced stronger children. The breeding selection extended to rejecting entire categories of potential parents. Men who showed cowardice in battle were forbidden from marrying. Women who were too small, too weak, or had any physical imperfection that might be passed to children were discouraged or prevented from reproducing. The state maintained records of family lines, tracking which families consistently produced strong warriors and which produced weaklings. Families with good records were encouraged to have many children. Families with poor records faced social pressure to stop reproducing. But the real brutality began after birth, starting with the infant inspection I described at the beginning. This wasn't a medical examination to ensure infant health. It was a quality control check where state officials would kill any baby deemed substandard. The criteria for rejection were arbitrary and harsh. Any visible physical imperfection meant death. A birthmark in the wrong place, fingers that seemed too long or too short, eyes that didn't track perfectly, a cry that seemed too weak. Any of these could result in a baby being taken from his mother and thrown into the apothetai chasm. Archaeological excavations in 2007, at a site believed to be near the ancient apothetai location, uncovered human remains, including bones of very young infants, some showing signs of impact trauma consistent with being thrown from height. The bones were mixed with animal remains and broken pottery, suggesting the location was used as a general disposal site for anything Sparta considered waste, including human babies who failed to meet warrior standards. Mothers had no right to protest or appeal these decisions. The state owned all children from birth. A woman who tried to hide a rejected infant or who argued against the official's decision could face severe punishment, including having all her children taken away and being exiled from Sparta. The system was designed to make mothers complicit in their own children's deaths, to force them to accept that their baby's value was purely utilitarian, measured only by potential for military service. If an infant passed the initial inspection, he would stay with his mother until age 7. But even these early years were controlled by the state. Spartan mothers were explicitly instructed not to coddle or comfort their children excessively. Crying babies were often ignored, left to cry themselves to exhaustion. Spartan educational philosophy held that learning to endure discomfort without expectation of comfort was foundational training that should begin in infancy. Plutarch records that Spartan babies were bathed in wine instead of water, a practice believed to identify weak children who would convulse or sicken from the alcohol exposure. Babies who had adverse reactions were sometimes killed at this point, even if they'd passed the initial inspection. The wine baths were another selection layer, another filter to remove anyone who didn't meet Spartan standards for physical resilience. At age 7, the real horror began. This is when boys were taken from their mothers and entered the eugenics, the state education system that would control every aspect of their lives for the next 13 years. The removal was abrupt and absolute. No gradual transition, no preparation, no goodbye visits. On the assigned day, officials would come to each home and take the 7-year-old boys. Mothers who cried or protested were publicly shamed for being weak and for trying to interfere with the state's property. The boys were organized into groups called agili, herds, a term deliberately chosen to emphasize they were no longer individuals with families, but were livestock being raised for Sparta's use. Each agile contained boys of the same age who would train together, compete against each other, and eventually fight together in the Spartan army. The eugenics was structured around systematized deprivation and violence. Boys were given inadequate food, deliberately kept hungry to teach them to endure privation and to encourage them to steal. But if they were caught stealing, they were brutally punished, not for stealing, but for being caught, for showing insufficient skill in deception. The logic was that successful warriors needed to be able to forage and steal from enemies without being detected. Historical accounts describe boys so hungry they would eat raw meat, catch and eat mice and other vermin, steal from altars where food offerings had been left for the gods. One famous story tells of a Spartan boy who stole a fox, hid it under his cloak, and then allowed the fox to bite and claw his stomach rather than reveal the theft when questioned by instructors. The boy allegedly died from the injuries without ever admitting what he'd hidden. This story was held up as an ideal of Spartan courage and discipline. The boys slept in barracks on rough reed mattresses they made themselves. In winter, they were encouraged to add thistledown to their reeds, but even this small comfort was framed as making them soft. Boys who created too comfortable sleeping arrangements would have their mattresses destroyed and would be beaten for showing weakness. Physical abuse was constant and systematic. Instructors would beat boys for any perceived failure, any sign of weakness, any expression of emotion that suggested they were thinking about family or home. Older boys were encouraged, and sometimes required to beat younger boys as part of their own training. The system created a hierarchy of violence where everyone except the youngest was simultaneously victim and perpetrator. One particularly disturbing practice was the diamastagosis, the ritual whipping ceremony held annually at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Teenage boys would be whipped continuously while trying to steal cheeses from the altar. The goal wasn't to get the cheese. The goal was to endure the whipping without crying out or showing pain. Boys who screamed or tried to avoid the whips brought shame to their families. Boys who died during the whipping, and some did, were honored as having shown ultimate courage. Archaeological excavations at the Artemis Orthia sanctuary uncovered a Roman-era stone theater built specifically for watching this whipping ceremony, suggesting the practice continued for centuries and became a spectator event where crowds would watch Spartan boys being beaten bloody at an altar. But physical abuse was only part of the eugenics. Psychological manipulation was equally important in breaking down individual identity and creating warriors who would obey without question. Boys were forced to compete against each other constantly. Every meal, every training exercise, every moment of their lives was ranked and evaluated. Instructors would deliberately create situations where boys had to choose between helping a friend and securing their own position. Showing loyalty to specific other boys was discouraged and punished. The goal was to prevent formation of strong individual friendships that might create divided loyalties. At the same time, boys were taught that their aegile, their group, was everything. Individual survival meant nothing. Group success was all that mattered. This contradiction: be ruthlessly competitive with your aegile members, but also be willing to die for the aegile, created psychological tension that broke many boys mentally. Boys who couldn't handle the contradictions, who became too emotional or too detached, who showed signs of what we would now recognize as trauma responses, were labeled as failures. Some were expelled from the eugenics, losing all rights of Spartan citizenship and becoming periakoi, second-class residents with no political rights and no honor. Others were simply killed, their deaths explained as training accidents or as results of weakness that made them unsuitable for warrior life. Let me tell you about the Cryptia, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Spartan warrior training. This was a secret rite of passage for the most promising 18-year-old Spartans, a test that required them to commit murder to prove their worthiness for full citizenship. Selected teenage boys would be given daggers and sent into the countryside with orders to hide during the day and hunt at night. But they weren't hunting animals. They were hunting helots, the enslaved population that did all agricultural and manual labor in Sparta. The teenage warriors were supposed to kill helots, particularly strong young helot men who might pose a threat if they ever rebelled, and to do so without being caught or identified. This served multiple purposes. It provided real combat experience, teaching boys to kill humans rather than just training dummies. It terrorized the helot population, creating constant fear that kept them submissive, and it made every Spartan warrior complicit in murder, ensuring they could never develop empathy for the enslaved population that outnumbered Spartans by perhaps 7 to 1. The Cryptia wasn't a rare occurrence or an emergency measure. It was an annual event, a formalized part of the training system. Every year, dozens of teenage Spartans would murder dozens of helots. Those who killed successfully and without being caught earned honor. Those who refused or failed were expelled from the warrior class. Historical sources are divided on exact numbers, but estimates suggest that during the roughly 400 years the eugenics system operated at full strength, the Cryptia was responsible for killing at least 10,000 helots, probably more. These weren't combatants or criminals. They were enslaved farmers, laborers, and craftsmen killed by teenage boys as a training exercise. Now let me tell you what happened to the boys who survived the eugenics, who made it through 13 years of systematic abuse, deprivation, and psychological conditioning. At age 20, they became full Spartan citizens and joined the army. But they still didn't have normal lives. Spartan warriors lived in military barracks until age 30. They ate communal meals with their military unit every single day. They were required to contribute food to these meals from their land holdings, creating economic pressure that reinforced social control. A Spartan who couldn't afford his meal contributions would lose citizenship rights and be demoted to a lower social class. Even after age 30, when warriors were finally allowed to live with their wives, they were still required to spend most of their time with their military units. The family was deliberately kept weak in Sparta. Fathers barely knew their children. Husbands barely knew their wives. All meaningful relationships were supposed to be within the military structure. This system produced the ancient world's most feared warriors. At the Battle of Thermopylae, in 480 BC, 300 Spartan warriors held off a Persian force estimated at over 100,000 for 3 days. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, 10,000 Spartan hoplites formed the core of the Greek force that decisively defeated the Persians. For over 200 years, Sparta dominated Greek military affairs, and other city-states feared and respected Spartan warriors as nearly superhuman fighters. But this military excellence came at an extraordinary cost. Sparta's total population never exceeded perhaps 30,000 citizens, and it was constantly declining because the eugenics system killed or crippled so many children. The demand for perfection meant that large numbers of infants and children were eliminated before they could contribute to society. Sparta produced no significant art, no philosophy, no scientific advances, no literature. Spartan warriors were famous for being laconic, speaking very little, because their education focused entirely on fighting and gave them no training in rhetoric, debate, or cultural expression. They were weapons, highly effective, but incapable of being anything else. The Spartan breeding and training system eventually destroyed Sparta itself. By the 4th century BC, the citizen population had declined so much that Sparta could no longer field effective armies. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, Thebes defeated Sparta decisively, killing over 400 of the perhaps 1,500 full Spartan citizens who still existed. Sparta never recovered from this loss. The final irony is that the system designed to create perfect warriors became so extreme, so focused on eliminating weakness, that it eliminated the population base necessary for a functioning society. Sparta bred itself into extinction by trying to breed perfect warriors. Modern historians often romanticize Sparta, presenting it as an ideal of discipline, courage, and military excellence. Movies like 300 portray Spartan warriors as heroic defenders of freedom. But this is fantasy. Sparta was a dystopian eugenics experiment that destroyed thousands of children, traumatized the survivors, and created a society incapable of sustaining itself long-term. The practices I've described weren't aberrations or exaggerations by Sparta's enemies. They were documented by multiple ancient sources, confirmed by archaeological evidence, and openly discussed by Spartans themselves as necessary features of their system. If this story has shocked you, if you're disturbed by how systematic child abuse and eugenics were normalized in ancient Sparta, then subscribe to this channel, because history is full of societies that did horrific things while believing they were horrific things, while believing they were creating something great. Drop a comment right now telling me what aspect of Spartan breeding practices disturbed you most. The infant selection and killing? The starvation and abuse of children? The Cryptia murders? The complete destruction of family bonds? And remember this: Sparta isn't that different from other societies that tried to engineer human excellence through control and violence. The 20th century saw multiple attempts to create superior humans through eugenics and brutal training. North Korea's Military First Society echoes Spartan priorities. Any system that treats humans as raw material to be shaped for state purposes, that values collective goals over individual humanity, that believes suffering and cruelty produce strength, is following in Sparta's footsteps. The lesson from Sparta isn't that discipline and training are bad. It's that societies that value military power above all else, that treat children as state property, that systematically eliminate anyone deemed imperfect, inevitably destroy themselves. The perfect warriors Sparta created weren't worth the cost of creating them. Until next time, keep questioning whether the ancient societies we're taught to admire were actually as glorious as the legends claim. The truth is always darker, more complex, and more human than the myths we inherit.